is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The dramatic return of the Taliban to power in Afghanistan has sent geopolitical shockwaves in many parts, including here in Africa. Images coming out of Kabul since mid-August continue to confirm the Taliban's hold. The United States is rushing to beat a fast-approaching deadline on its 20-year military presence, as countries across the world now reckon with the likelihood of a Taliban-led government. So how are events currently unfolding on the refugee and humanitarian front? And is the United States' sudden and chaotic exit an indictment to foreign military intervention? And are there lessons to be drawn from this experience by African countries? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Thank you for joining us on the program. Now, there is a famous saying that goes, quote, "You have the watches, but we have the time," end quote. Some say that this is an old Afghan proverb, while others attribute it specifically to the Taliban. We may never know exactly from which side these words came from, but what is not in question is how things have come full circle in Afghanistan. The US forces began their campaign against the Taliban in October of 2011, and in August 2021, they fully withdrawn. Today, the Taliban is back in charge. But what has been the cost of conflict in Afghanistan? The numbers are many and vary, but we'll focus on these two areas. Nearly 6 million Afghans have been forcibly displaced from their homes over the past 4 decades. 3 million are displaced within Afghanistan, while a further 2.6 million Afghans have been forced to flee their country. Going by these numbers, 15% of Afghanistan's population today has been displaced due to the conflict at one point. Over the past 20 years of the conflict in Afghanistan, at least 47,245 Afghan civilians have been killed in the war. 66,000 Afghan national military and police members have also been killed, as well as at least 51,191 Taliban and opposition fighters. 72 journalists and 444 aid workers have also been caught up in the crossfire. For many Afghan people, conflicts and insecurity have tainted daily life. It is estimated that 70% of the country's population has been born during the war. In the wake of the Taliban takeover in Kabul, I spoke to Mohammad Suhail Shaheen, spokesman of the Taliban, to hear his thoughts on Afghanistan's situation and what lies ahead under a Taliban regime. Let's listen in. Mohammad Suhail Shaheen, spokesperson for the Taliban, thank you very much for joining us on CGTN Africa. Let's start with the most recent development now, because you did say that Afghanistan has started a new phase of peace. Now, it's been almost a week since you took over, and there's been chaos and confusion that continues with thousands of Afghans trying to flee the country. What is your assessment of the refugee and humanitarian situation in your country?
There is a two situation. One is inside the airport. That situation was created by the foreigners or the foreign countries, because they circulated a rumor that everyone who wants to go to resettle in Western countries, they should come to the airport and take plane and go there. So that is why the people rallied there, assembled at the airport with a huge congestion of people there. This is one thing created by them. And the other is the security. The security in the city, the Kabul city, there is a full security, and our people are in control of the security situation in the city. So it's a two situation, different situation. What is artificially created by the foreigners, and the other is the real situation inside the city.
All right, Mr. Shaheen, I want to look back a little bit for context on how the Taliban and Afghanistan got to where it is, because the Taliban were in charge when the US and allied forces invaded Afghanistan in 2001, and the Taliban are now back in charge in 2021, 20 years later, at the end of that war. In your view, what could have been a better solution here, a better option rather than the US intervention in Afghanistan?
20 years ago, I was Deputy Ambassador of Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan in Islamabad. At that time, I did many interviews with different media outlets urging that the issue of Afghanistan should be resolved through talks in peaceful means. If not, the foreign troops invade Afghanistan and occupy our countries. So I am telling all and warn all that Afghanistan is a swamp. If you move forward, the further you move, the further you will bog down in this swamp. So better to talk before any bloodshed and destruction on both sides to resolve this issue peacefully. It is better for all. But no one listened. At that time, they were so emotional, invaded Afghanistan. But I think if they now think over what was said 20 years ago, they may know that it was the best option.
So, Mr. Shaheen, as you look towards the cooperation and partnership with countries around the world, there is the issue of acceptability and recognition, especially with your development partners who are cutting back. They include the European Union, who have said it does not recognize the Taliban. What are you doing to instill confidence in the international community and possibly future partners?
As I said, the people of Afghanistan wanted a change. The people of Afghanistan wanted an independent country. They were not happy with occupation. They offered hundreds of thousands of sacrifices in the way of liberation of the country. So this is a government of the people. So it will, as we are in the process of forming it. So why I don't know why those who are advocating human rights, they are not accepting a people government, a government which is the people of Afghanistan wants. So it will not be fear that because of their bias and past hostility, they still continue, linger on to the future and take decision which will be a kind of violation of human rights, not ignoring the demand of the people of Afghanistan.
All right. So we're looking, the world is looking at Afghanistan as it settles down under the Taliban now. What are the issues that are likely to form the pillars of Taliban's foreign policy?
Our foreign policy is that we want to have good relation with our neighbors, regional countries, and the world countries. We welcome their investment in Afghanistan in many fields. The Afghanistan needs their cooperation. Secondly, we do not want Afghanistan be a ground of rivalries, but a ground of cooperation of all countries.
As you seek that cooperation, many will be wondering if ideology is going to be a key driver of this policy, and if so, what kind of ideology?
We are the Muslim of Afghanistan. They are Muslim people, and our government, Islamic government. That is our internal policy. But about external policy, we want to have a good relation with all countries, especially neighboring countries, regional countries, on the basis of mutual respect and mutual interest.
All right. African countries as well are going to be looking to see what kind of cooperation will come out of Afghanistan. In which areas are the Taliban, though, likely to establish partnerships and cooperation with African countries?
We need in all sectors. It is education sector, in the infrastructure, agriculture, industry, especially natural resources. We have huge natural resources in Afghanistan. There is need for investment in those resources.
All right, so the Taliban have guaranteed that they will not provide a haven for extremist or terrorist groups. Is that your view? What do you say to that?
Yes, we have guarantee and we have commitment on the basis of Doha Agreement. We will not provide any haven to all those who have a foreign agenda and want to use the soil of Afghanistan against other countries. It is against our policy and against our national interest.
So as you begin your new journey of peace, as you begin rebuilding Afghanistan, what do you think will be your biggest challenges? What do you see as your priorities? And generally, what will be your message for the people of Afghanistan themselves?
For the people of Afghanistan, my message is that we have gained independence. It is a pride for all of Afghans, also for the coming generations. We, the people of Afghanistan, should have tolerance with each other, a peaceful coexistence, and they should come together to rebuild our country and make it in every term like equal to other countries in terms of education, development, and prosperous life in the country. That is my message to our people, and to foreign countries. My message is especially those who are after seeking sanction against Afghanistan. So we hope they should abandon that and rather than seek cooperation with us, we will come their cooperation, because such biased and partial hostile standing against Afghanistan is ultimately against the people of Afghanistan. So we hope they abandon their former ways and focus on future and mutual relation with us.
Mohammed Suhail Shaheen, spokesperson for the Taliban, thank you very much for granting us this interview, and thank you for joining us on CGTN Africa.
Thank you.
Mr. Suhail Shaheen there when I spoke to him earlier. Now, in a moment, we'll bring on board our panel of experts to further unpack what these developments in Afghanistan mean. But first, let's take a short break. Stay tuned.
The Taliban regime is coming to an end.
There's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's now bring in our panel of guests joining us via Zoom. Matthew Saltmarsh is in London. He's a senior external relations officer at the UNHCR. Michael Semple is in Belfast. He's an expert on Afghanistan and Pakistan. at the Senator George Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice at Queen's University. And in London, Andrew Yao Chie, he is a senior fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Thank you all for joining us on the program. Michael, if I may start off with you, because the U.S. and allied forces invaded Afghanistan in 2001. The U.S. forces are rushing out 20 years later. We are to some extent aware of the political situation in Afghanistan, but paint for us the socio-economic picture of the Afghanistan that has been left behind.
Well, really, that picture has changed dramatically over the past 10 days. The Afghanistan that we thought the US might be leaving behind would be one of an Islamic republic with some kind of representative democracy, some kind of stake for all citizens of the country in that democracy, country which was poor but which was gradually coming to grips with its economic and social challenges. Instead, the US is leaving essentially a revolutionary situation with an Islamist movement which has a base only in the clergy and only in one ethnic group of the four major ethnic groups of the country, which is trying to consolidate its hold on power, has got to deal with sort of an internal struggle, as many revolutionary movements do, and also has to try and force itself upon a population which really has had no stake in this change. The country is left even poorer than it would have been if there'd been a smooth transition. So I'd say it is a revolutionary and turbulent situation that the US leaves behind.
So, Andrew, I want to get your thoughts on that, but also looking as well at Africa's own, foreign interventions, Libya, Somalia, Mali, which, these countries still remain problematic decades later. I mean, give us an understanding of what these foreign interventions actually mean and draw a parallel for us with what's happened in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much for having me. Well, I don't know if I can draw a comparison or a parallel conditions, because Afghanistan is very different from various parts of Africa. But what I think, or a few things that I think are in common, is that what this has demonstrated is that many of the armed groups, particularly those I'm thinking of Boko Haram, which has been weakened more recently, but Al-Qaeda, Islamic State West Africa Province, Greater Sahara, ADF, and even the Al-Shabaab groups in Al-Shabaab, but also in Mozambique, it does demonstrate a willingness to go the long haul. And what I mean by this is to use strategic operations via the terrorist groups, or terrorist groups using these strategies to potentially win a long-term game, because there will be disinterest. And so I think what the withdrawal does do is signal to these terrorist groups on the ground that actually, if they continue in the right direction at some point, and we are seeing that. You've seen interventions, for example, in Somalia, right, where states like the European Union have sort of pulled out, or have what's the word I would say, have withdrawn some of their funding. But what does this mean for these states? But I think what it does do is open a larger question, which is how do we actually look at these agreements? And I'm thinking here of examples of Sudan, South Sudan, or of Mali, where these transitional agreements have been put in place, but are not people-centered, and not focused on dealing with the root causes of these issues, are not focused on how you deal with governance issues, how you bring parties together, but also how you resolve the root causes and long-term causes. So,
Andrew, though, in your view, if you're talking about there is a lack of a proper, transition, there is a question of how do we deal with a smooth transition here. Are we looking back and saying perhaps foreign interventions in the long run are not working?
Well, I think it's different. Afghanistan, it was a different situation. I'm not an Afghanistan expert, so I'll let those who are on this session speak to that. But I think what is different with the African examples that we are seeing more recently, you're seeing more regional ad hoc security initiatives, so more regional partners or countries coming together outside the regional economic communities or bodies, forming coalition of the willing to be able to intervene. What is supplementing that is, I would argue, the increase in levels of military assistance. And so again, it becomes one-sided on trying to defeat, as opposed to understanding why these groups emerge, how they've emerged, and what are the long-term solutions to dealing with some of the grievances that they might have.
Right, Matthew, I want to look at the humanitarian fallout here, because the occupation and the subsequent withdrawal of U.S. forces has left us with a humanitarian crisis, catastrophe, if you can call it that. What is the extent of the refugee crisis?
Of course, as you know, Afghanistan has been in protracted crisis for 4 decades or so. There is and was already a very significant refugee population, something like an estimated 2.6 million refugees, Afghan refugees. The vast majority of those, something like almost 90% of those, being hosted in neighboring countries of Pakistan and Iran. I mean, as to the position today, we're looking at the moment primarily at an internal displacement crisis. The latest data show that over 500,000 people have been internally displaced within the country so far this year. So the focus from the UN agencies and the NGOs is very much at this stage supporting those in country with vital humanitarian assistance. Of course, you can't rule out the possibility of larger flows going over the borders. At this stage, the numbers have been limited because the borders are more or less closed, apart from for trade and for those with documentation. However, of course, contingency planning is underway, both from the United Nations, but also from those neighboring countries. And what our call to all the countries in the region is do keep your borders open in case it's needed in the eventuality of increased refugee outflows.
Michael, I do want to go back to the interventionist policies here of the United States. I mean, where does this failure in Afghanistan now leave the US and interventionist policies, particularly in the Middle East and in Africa?
Well, I think by the way that the United States extricated itself from Afghanistan, it was sending a clear and a deliberate signal that it doesn't want to be involved in long-term interventions. It's moved on to other priorities. So, the first message is we don't want to do more. But I think there are a couple of other serious messages. One is that the way in which the exit specifically was handled, in other words, the final stage of the intervention, many people have considered to be really quite irresponsible. Very few people were advocating a further long-term presence of U.S. forces. What they had been advocating was that the U.S. should make some investment in the Afghan government. And prepare the way with the Taliban even for exiting, so that they would exit with an interim arrangement or with the Afghan government strong enough to maintain control of the situation. Essentially, the US showed that it was not just uninterested in new interventions, but was prepared to be pretty ruthless and reckless in extricating itself without care for the consequences in the region. I think then the next problem which the US will carry with itself for further engagement, whether it's like strategic partnerships rather than engagements, is the question of allies. I mean, as we speak, many people who until only 10 days ago considered themselves to be, in personal terms, strategic partners of the United States. Right. They're struggling for their lives. They're trying to avoid being caught by the Taliban. Those who are still on the ground in Afghanistan holding territory, feel themselves abandoned. Now, anybody that the US sits down to talk with and propose joint action or alliance, they will be well aware of the fate of these people, and they will drive a much harder bargain before agreeing to cooperate with the United States.
That is a very interesting perspective from Michael. And Andrew, looking at those signals that have been sent out by that hurried, exit from Afghanistan there, what lessons, can Africa learn when it comes to, this experience from foreign interventions?
I think Michael touched on this a little bit, and I think one thing is it should be thinking about, particularly African states. I'm thinking of the Horn here, but also in West Africa, about what its long-term partnership looks like. How does it want the US to engage with it? But I also said earlier, the point being that the engagement that the US currently has with many African states is slightly different from that of Afghanistan. in the sense that most of the work now that the US is trying to do is trying to tackle terrorism, but also through military support and training. And so that is very different to what we see in Afghanistan. What I worry about is that sort of military training that is going into building African armies or to helping them or assisting them to deal with terrorist organizations. What is going to be the impact on those militaries and how they interact with the people? And when I'm talking about people, I'm talking about the person in the rural village who might have a grievance, an issue, and then the military comes in with a very heavy-handed tactic, or classifying everything as a terrorist act. And I think that's the concern that I have long term. How does it impact on African armies? One, on their professionalism, but also on their civil military engagement as well.
All right, there's definitely a lot to look at there, but I want to get a final comment from you all regarding, though, the G7 summit that has just taken place on Afghanistan. What are your views on the outcomes and developments from that emergency G7 summit on Afghanistan? And Michael, let me start off with you on this.
I would say that the G7 and the world more broadly have not yet come to terms with just how profound is this change in Afghanistan and the extent to which it will have implications for Afghanistan itself, inside the region, in South Asia, across the whole of the Muslim world, and at a global scale. The response from the G7 simply does not start to come to grips with this. We will be dealing with the consequences of these developments for the next 50 years. This is a force capture of a state by a small group acting in defiance of their own people, in defiance of agreements and undertakings which they themselves have made, in defiance of the United States, and in defiance of the whole international community working through the United Nations. The ramifications of this will be inspiring and influencing armed movements across the globe for the next 50 years.
Matthew, your thoughts?
Well, the needs inside Afghanistan are going to be huge. Up until now, recently, we have had assurances from the Taliban that the United Nations and NGOs can continue to do their work in the country. We take them at their word, and we hope that they continue to uphold that. But the international community is going to have to step forward with more support, more targeted aid, both inside Afghanistan, for the internal displacement crisis that's unfolding in front of our eyes right now, but also for the neighbors who continue to host displaced Afghan people and may have to host more in future. So groups like the G7 are going to have to step up and focus more on Afghanistan and the region in the coming weeks and months, and probably the longer term as well.
Andrew, your views?
I think for me, the biggest takeaway, and Michael touched on this, is it's not just about dealing. I mean, the phrase goes, if someone has a gushing wound, you don't put a plaster over it. And this is what I see taking place at the moment. There has to be an ability to understand what is going on, to be able to get people to buy into the situation and to want to resolve the issue for themselves. And what I mean by that, and if I compare that and use the African example here, it's really about how do you get a people-centered approach that deals with a peripheral stabilization tools that helps enable states, but also the people to govern themselves.
Very insightful discussion indeed. Thank you all very much for joining us on the program. And that's all we have time for on Talk Africa this week. A big thank you to our panelists for their insights. In London, Matthew Saltmarsh, a Senior External Relations Officer at the UNHCR. In Belfast, Michael Semple, an expert on Afghanistan and Pakistan. He's with the Senator George Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice at Queen's University. And in London, Andrew Yochi, a Senior Fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Now, I would love to hear your views on this subject. You can engage with us on our social media platforms, on Twitter and Facebook, and also catch this and more episodes of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. See you again next time on Talk Africa. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Goodbye.